Imagine you're standing on the moon. You're more than 380,000 kilometers from Earth. There is no rescue team coming, no second spacecraft waiting nearby, and suddenly you discover that something inside your spacecraft is broken. Now you have only one question. Can you still get home? This wasn't science fiction. This actually happened during Apollo 11. And the strangest part is that this wasn't even the most dangerous moment of the mission. On July 16, 1969, 3 astronauts left, Earth aboard one of the most powerful machines ever built.
1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Their destination was the moon. But Apollo 11 wasn't just a scientific mission. It was also part of a massive competition. Between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Soviets had already shocked the world by launching Sputnik and sending Yuri Gagarin into space. America needed to respond, and President John F. Kennedy gave NASA an extraordinary goal: land a human on the moon and bring them safely back before the end of the decade.
Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
At the time, this sounded almost impossible. Computers were extremely limited compared with today's technology. There was no modern GPS, no smartphone, and no powerful computer sitting in every pocket. NASA had to solve problems that humans had never solved before. So they tested, failed, learned, and tested again. Apollo 7, Apollo 8, Apollo 9, Apollo 10. Each mission helped NASA understand another piece of the puzzle. Then came Apollo 11. The Saturn V rocket lifted off, carrying 3 astronauts toward the moon. But Apollo 11 wasn't one simple spacecraft. It was made of different sections with different jobs. Eventually, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, called Eagle, while Michael Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting the moon. That meant something terrifying. If Eagle couldn't take off again, Armstrong and Aldrin could be stranded on the lunar surface with no simple way home. Then, during the descent, something unexpected happened. The computer began producing alarms. For a moment, the astronauts didn't know how serious the problem was. Mission Control had to decide whether to continue the landing or abort. They continued. But there was another problem. The automatic system was guiding Eagle toward an area filled with large rocks. Armstrong took manual control and searched for a safer landing site while the fuel continued to run down. Imagine trying to land on another world while knowing that every second is bringing you closer to running out of fuel. Finally, Armstrong reported that Eagle had landed.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Humanity had reached the moon, but the mission was far from over. Armstrong and Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface, collected samples, took photographs, and deployed scientific equipment. Then they returned to Eagle, and that's when another problem appeared. A circuit breaker switch that was important for activating the ascent engine had been damaged. Without that engine, they couldn't leave the moon. There was no repair crew, no spare switch, and no hardware store waiting outside. So they had to improvise. A simple pen was used to press the damaged switch mechanism, allowing the astronauts to activate the system. Then came the moment that mattered most. Eagle's ascent engine fired, and the lunar module lifted away from the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin reunited with Collins, and the 3 astronauts began their journey back to Earth. But even then, nobody could be completely certain they would make it home. NASA had prepared for the possibility of disaster, including a speech that would have been delivered if Armstrong and Aldrin had been stranded on the moon. Think about that. While millions of people were watching what looked like one of humanity's greatest achievements, officials on Earth were also preparing for the possibility that 2 astronauts might never return. Fortunately, they never needed that speech. Apollo reached Earth, entered the atmosphere, deployed its parachutes, and splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 astronauts survived. But decades later, another question became famous. If humans really went to the moon, why do some of the photographs look so strange? Why aren't stars visible? Why does the American flag appear to move? And why do some shadows seem to point in different directions? These questions became the foundation of one of the most famous conspiracy theories in history. The idea that the moon landing was staged. But when you examine the evidence, these mysteries have much simpler explanations. Take the flag. It wasn't blowing in lunar wind because the moon has essentially no atmosphere. The flag had a horizontal support rod designed to keep it extended, and when the astronauts moved the pole while planting it, the fabric vibrated. Without air resistance to quickly stop that movement, the motion lasted longer. What about the missing stars? The lunar surface and the astronauts were brightly illuminated by sunlight. So the cameras were exposed for those bright objects. Stars are much fainter, so they didn't appear in those photographs. And the strange-looking shadows? The moon's uneven surface, reflected sunlight, and camera perspective can make shadows appear unusual. A photograph looking strange doesn't automatically mean it was filmed on a Hollywood set. There's also a much bigger problem for the idea that Apollo 11 was completely fabricated. The United States wasn't the only country watching the mission. The Soviet Union was America's biggest competitor in the space race, and Soviet tracking systems could monitor the mission's signals and trajectory. If the United States had staged the entire landing, exposing the deception would have been an enormous propaganda victory for the Soviets. Instead, the mission became one of the defining achievements of the space race, and Apollo 11 wasn't the end. More Apollo missions followed, and humans returned to the lunar surface several times. Astronauts collected hundreds of kilograms of lunar samples and deployed scientific instruments that continued providing valuable information. So why did humans stop going to the moon? Because reaching the moon wasn't simply about courage. It required enormous amounts of money, engineering, testing, political support, and human effort. Once the United States had achieved its major goal in the space race, political and public enthusiasm began to decline. Apollo 17 became the last Apollo mission to land humans on the moon, and for decades, no human being returned to the lunar surface. But here's where the story gets interesting. Humanity is trying to go back. NASA's Artemis program aims to return astronauts to the moon and build a new era of lunar exploration. This time, the question isn't simply, can humans reach the moon? We already know the answer. The bigger question is whether humans can stay there, conduct long-term scientific research, develop infrastructure, and use the moon as a stepping stone toward deeper destinations such as Mars. Apollo 11 proved that humans could reach another world, but perhaps its greatest lesson wasn't really about the moon. It was about what happens when humans attempt something that seems impossible. On that mission, things went wrong. The computer produced alarms. The landing site had to change. Fuel was running dangerously low. A critical switch was damaged, and the astronauts still had to find a way home. Yet they made it. That's why Apollo 11 remains much more than a famous photograph or a moment in history. It was a technological gamble, a political competition, a scientific experiment, and one of humanity's greatest adventures. The first human footprints on the moon were made in 1969. But the story of humanity on the moon may have only just begun.